We very much appreciate you joining today's forum. You'll hear insights on how strong companies blend capabilities with resiliency for strategic advantage. Our featured speaker today is John Paul McDuffie, Professor of Management at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and the Director of the Program on Vehicle and Mobility Innovation at Wharton. He'll discuss his innovative approach to resolving contradictions between risk management and core strategy. Our two panelist speakers are members of the Folk Center's Global Advisory Board. Romain Seguin, President of Global Freight Forwarding at UPS, and Al Langto, Executive Director, Global Accounts North America at Lenovo. They bring their expertise to you today from their long careers and experience living in a variety of countries, running their business operations. Please welcome John Paul, Romain, and Al. Today's program is moderated by Jerry McDermott, Professor of International Business at the Moore School and Faculty Director of the Folk Center. The Folk Center is the hub for international business, education, research, and leadership at the Darla Moore School of Business here at the University of South Carolina. The center's mission is to advance leadership and ideas to help businesses and communities thrive in a complex world. The Moore School's International Business Program has been nationally ranked as #1 by US News and World Report for more than 20 years. My thanks and appreciation to Governor Jim Hodges and his wife Rachel for their ongoing support of our forum series. Our Moore School partners for this forum, Greg Niehaus of the Risk and Uncertainty Management Center, and Sanjay Ahire of the Operations and Supply Chain Center. Members of the Folk Center's board, and the Moore School faculty, staff, students, and alumni for their rich commitment to international business. In closing, this forum is being recorded. The full forum will be posted on our Folk Center website next week and captioned for accessibility. Please submit your questions by using the Q&A function. It is now my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Jerry McDermott, Professor of International Business, who will be our moderator. Jerry.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for everybody who's been able to take some time out of their busy day to attend another one of our folks forums. And I want to remind you all that if you look to the bottom of your screen, there is a function there and it's called Q&A, and that is where you submit your questions or comments. I'll be then screening them or putting them together and delivering them to our panelists. If you have a general question, no problem. If you want to have a question or comment directed at a particular person on our panel, please tell me so. Okay, and without any further delay, I want to get to the main attraction, our group of panelists. You've heard a little bit about them. They have an incredibly distinguished backgrounds, all of them. But I'm especially pleased to have John Paul McDuffie, who I've known for almost 30 years, first at MIT, and then we were together at Wharton. John Paul is known far and wide in academic, business, and policy circles as being a leading thinker and innovator on issues of everything from lean production to supply chain relationships and organizational capabilities. So the title of the talk and really his presentation, something that he's generated with he and his team over the past year, as we call it, is post-pandemic strategy, how to reconcile resiliency and efficiency in your company. So I'm going to turn it over to John Paul right now, and he's going to give a presentation for about 20 minutes. And then our other two panelists are going to come in with their own perspectives. They'll go back and forth a little bit, and then we're going to open it up to everybody out there on a Q&A. But like I said, you can start to feed me Q&A or questions and comments as they speak. John Paul, over to you.
All right. Thank you, Jerry. It's great to be here. 30 years. Wow, that dates us. So I wasn't going to put a number of years on it, but so it goes. No, it's wonderful to be here, and thank you for the invitation. So I'm going to start sharing my screen now.
Okay.
To get everything set up. Get
Right.
out of this.
Looks good.
All right. Are we good?
Looks good. Excellent.
Thank you. Okay, so Jerry's already introduced the theme of the talk, so let me plunge right in. Well, you know, this time of COVID-19 has been really an unprecedented challenge, obviously, for global supply chains, for many, many things in our world. And let's see. The scope is probably greater than any other recent disaster, certainly from either natural or human sources. And how do we cope with a pandemic that moves around the world, affecting supply chains differently in different locations at different times? So this gentleman here has some words of wisdom for us. Dwight Eisenhower, President of the United States at the time, but a distinguished general in World War II, said the following, which is kind of a sentiment that's a guiding light for this whole talk. Plans are worthless, but planning is everything. There's a very great distinction, because when you're planning for an emergency, you must start with this one thing. The very definition of emergency is that it's unexpected. Therefore, it's not going to happen the way you are planning. So, you know, all of these current supply chain debates are focused on this trade-off between efficiency and resilience. And that's a real trade-off. But many of the calls, and I see it mostly in the media, but in conversations as well, that, okay, we need more resilience, we're going to have to give up some efficiency. I am going to argue that that's an untenable choice. Much better, and this is again the heart of my presentation today, is to invest in supply chain continuation capabilities that will boost both efficiency and resilience. So we all remember the really cataclysmic events, whether natural or man-made, that have caused impact on supply chains and so much else in our world. And it's not just us as individuals, companies too often are heavily affected by these giant events, and they focus a lot of their subsequent attention and analysis and further actions on that, because it makes such a deep impression and it's had such a big impact. Well, we're in a year, even 2021, of near constant disruptions of an amazing variety. We had the Ever Given ship stuck in the Suez Canal. We have all this congestion in the Long Beach, California port, which is affected by many things, but which is going to be made worse by all the delays at the Suez Canal, which will now release a whole lot of traffic to all these ports all over the world. This fire in the Renaissance factory makes semiconductor chips, particularly for the auto industry, same one that was affected by the tsunami and earthquake 10 years ago. One of the many contributing factors to giant chip shortages that are shutting down auto manufacturers all over the world. The brutal winter weather in Texas having, among many unexpected consequences, shutting down petrochemical plants and leading to plastic resin shortages, which are affecting the auto industry, but many others. And we've even got rubber shortages now, some of it just tied up in supply chains, which then affects tires. So that's just 2021. I guess some years are like that. It's been a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day, maybe year for supply chain disruptions at the moment. So, you know, one way that scholars of supply chains and disasters have thought about it is to try to distinguish external and internal causes, physical and human-made causes. But part of what's distinctive about COVID-19 is it seems to just blanket the whole map here and give us challenges in all these arenas. And I think it makes us think more deeply about the challenges of planning appropriately and having good plans for this kind of a crisis. Now, I will say that there are organizations that deal with disasters on a kind of just in case basis. So a disaster happens, particularly these cataclysmic ones. Organizations create a new unit, new roles, new people staffing them, new protocols to be ready when and if it happens again. And we have now a well-developed discipline of business continuity planning which often is premised on those risks and preparing for the future. But the problem with BCP, and I don't want to, you'll see that it stays in my own game plan, but there's danger that the things you put into your planning books, the data obsolescence, the capabilities you're preparing for, because you're sort of fighting the last war, may atrophy if you don't use them. You don't end up being as responsive as you want to be. You don't end up being as ready as you want to be. And for the people who staff those units, making arguments about how we have to be ready for the next time, when the rest of the organization is carrying on with operations and doesn't see anything happening, they may not listen, and they may stop listening, you know, very akin to the boy who cried wolf. And when the wolf is finally there, people aren't quite ready to respond. So, so it's not really the way to go. Now, for large global organizations, the world throws a constant steady stream of small disruptions at them. And you might think of this as a way to keep your muscles exercised if you're taking this approach, that each new disruption is a challenge to your capabilities that you want to be ready for, that you can learn from, that you can use to move on to the next stage. Edwin Ye is, for a time, was the SVP and COO of global procurement for Walmart, particularly with a focus on China at a time that a lot of their goods were coming from China. And I've been on a couple of panels with him, and he supports a lot of Wharton activities. He shared this daily disruption report. So this was a typical day at Walmart. You would, every morning at 7 a.m., get a summary of all of the global and local incidents categorized into these kinds of categories. And then they would figure out what to do. And they would have a morning meeting to coordinate responses. They had a set of the more typical responses that they would make, but they had other responses that were absolutely on the fly and needing to innovate. So we've got responses to natural disasters like the earthquake in Sichuan, to biomedical disasters like the avian flu, more akin to what's going on with COVID, although a more targeted place, but they were able to develop a global playbook off of that, sorry. A child labor concern, which caused them to ban the use of Uzbek cotton. And then more on the opportunity side, when there was a lot of demand for hit toys, booking up way in advance all the available air freight space so they could supply more of those toys than anyone else. So just a typical day in the life of the global operations folks at Walmart. Now, back to some of these current arguments about the efficiency resiliency trade-off. You know, oh my goodness, the just-in-time system is leaving us terribly vulnerable. We have to change it. We have to add and hold more buffer stocks. We have to have new suppliers, because it's obviously not good that we're only dependent on one or two key suppliers. Well, we need new locations, because when this part of the world is knocked out, that's really bad for us. So we have to add new locations. Maybe we even need some duplicate factories that are ready so we can quickly switch over to them when we desperately need something in the midst of a disaster. I mean, look, as a response to the kind of disasters we're having, all of these are understandable responses, but I still will argue that they are wrong-headed. Better is to make ongoing investments in what I'm calling these supply chain continuity capabilities. So let me move on to kind of explain a little bit more what I mean. Okay, I've got a lot of clicks to animate this slide, and I've been practicing it. So, but bear with me so you can follow the logic. I think the animation helps. So the idea here is we want to invest in these capabilities that are actually going to shift the performance frontier. So what you see here is a trade-off curve between efficiency and resilience. And before these investments in the capabilities, we've got a given performance frontier indicated here. And at the frontier P, firms are maximizing their performance at different points. So you've got equivalent performance based on the choices firms A, B, C, and D are making about where they want to be on that trade-off curve. So a firm X is below the performance frontier, and it can improve via current best practice. If it advances to B, then it's at the performance frontier. You can see that that brings higher efficiency and resilience from moving to B. Now, they could decide to move from X to C. That would give them equivalent efficiency, but a lot more resilience. So anyway, it's only convenient that I'm showing you could move from X to B, because you could move from X to any point on that curve that you decide is where you should be. Now, after investing in these capabilities, my argument is going to be the following. You're now creating a new performance frontier. You're pushing out the performance frontier. New things are going to be possible. We'll call this P star. And that doesn't change the fact that there's a trade-off between efficiency and resilience. It just shifts the frontier to P star, okay? Now, that same firm X that improved to the position of B, if it continues on that trajectory, will now be improving to B1. And at B1, as you can see, you get more efficiency and more resilience compared to B. And then there's always the possibility, once you're on the new performance frontier, of shifting either towards more efficiency up the trade-off curve or more resilience, shifting down the trade-off curve in that direction. But the main point is that opening up that new performance frontier gives you whole new opportunities to improve both efficiency and resilience without having to sacrifice either compared to where you were before. So what are these supply chain continuation capabilities? We organize them into three categories, and Jerry mentioned my colleagues for this. Takahiro Fujimoto, professor at the University of Tokyo, someone else I've known for over 30 years, research colleague, close friend, and Daniel Heller, who's a PhD doctoral student of Professor Fujimoto, who's now teaching at a faculty at a university in Taiwan. So the protective capability here has two parts. One is a action that you can take in the middle of a disaster when the disaster is apparent before it affects your facilities or your supply chain routes. So you can see why this might put a huge priority on being ready to move very quickly and responsively to what's happening. The disaster is happening and hasn't hit your facilities or your routes yet. You're going to try to take some protective action right then to make that happen. And really, our prime example that we were following very closely, particularly in Japan, the research team there, was when COVID came to Japan, factories there had some time to put protocols in place for controlling access in and out, doing testing, doing contact tracing, improving ventilation, establishing social distancing and the like, so that even if COVID cases were spiking outside the factory, they were able to keep the factory itself a safe place for continued operations. But there's another piece of protective that's proactive vis-a-vis these predictable disruptions. So if you're in an earthquake zone, you want to build your buildings to have some earthquake protection. If you know you're going to be facing some extreme temperatures, you're going to want to prepare your facilities for that. And I know we saw some power facilities in Texas that really were just betting that they'd never have very cold weather that would freeze things, and that was a mistaken bet, I think we can say at this point. Okay, so recovery as the second category of capability, the name is self-evident, but the point is to be able to do this quickly and safety after the damage caused by the disaster. And it's some combination of being ready with the right kinds of expertise and capabilities, and then being able to move very quickly, because what has exactly happened is not anything that you could have precisely anticipated. You're not going to be able to take a precise plan off the shelf and apply it. So a lot of times this means you want an advanced team that already knows a lot, let's say, about the factory that they're going to check out, so they can go quickly and on the spot estimate both what has happened, what the damage is, and what resources are needed. And then you've also got at the corporate level some teams of resources that are needed that are pre-identified, but they get sent out and they're controlled usually by some central control center at corporate, where they're making real-time adaptive revision of plans. So this kind of combination here of, yes, some of it is definitely preparation in a BCP kind of way, but a lot of it's being ready to move very quickly, to be very agile, and to do that kind of on-the-spot assessment of what is actually happening. And then the third is substitution. So sometimes recovery is going to take too long, and you need to actually consider going outside your facilities to other facilities in your network, or even to competitors or suppliers or anyone who can help you continue what you're doing with your supply chain and production. So again, this is something you're going to choose to do after damage from a disaster, but you need to have advanced knowledge of what your potential substitutes are, right? And there's two ways to do this. You can have an existing relationship with another factory in your own network, a supplier's factory, some other kind of manufacturer that has general capabilities, perhaps. You kind of know what they have as capability, and you've done some testing of whether you could actually move production to them. Dual virtualization is acknowledging that we're now in a world of digital manufacturing. And in a lot of cases here, this would be about pre-testing a digital recipe on someone else's equipment at an alternate site. So you would know that you'd be ready to potentially use that recipe for production at their site if it turns out to be necessary. So those two capabilities go together. And in many cases, what you're doing in a given situation is figuring out what time do I have to do these things? How big is the damage? You may have a certain stock of inventory and you think you can get to recovery before you use up that inventory. That way you may not face any interruption of continuity. But if recovery is going to take longer and you're going to use up all of your inventory, that's when you may be considering substitution, or you may be stepping up the resources that you put into recovery. So it's all an assessment of these different options in relation to each other. So this disaster capabilities map has all three of the capabilities here. It has examples. The top row are things that you do for each capability before the disaster, and therefore they're somewhat closer to BCP, but a lot of them I think really belong in this capability building category as well. And then the second row are the things that you've kind of laid the groundwork, but then you're acting in an emergent and flexible way based on what you're learning at the time. So again, remember the protective activity during the disaster is the disaster has happened, but it hasn't hit you yet. So what can you quickly do to mobilize activity? The things you've done to prepare your special rescue teams with the general purpose recovery tools, how quickly can you get them into the field doing the diagnosis on the spot? You've prepared the substitute sites, you've prepared some virtual dual virtualization tests, and how quickly can you ramp that up when that turns out to be necessary? So I have some examples from Toyota just to close things out. Then we're going to hear some examples, I'm sure, from Romain and from Al, and we can have a broader discussion as we take in some of the questions. But Toyota is a company, first of all, that my colleagues and I have studied for a long time. My colleagues in particular, after the giant earthquake and tsunami of March 11, 2011, they followed Toyota's disaster planning and capability investments for a long time. And so it makes sense to use them as a case study here, at least based on sort of my knowledge base. To start off, there's a few things to say about philosophy and about values and goals. So first of all, there's absolutely this view that we don't have to make a trade-off between daily competitiveness and disaster readiness, or between efficiency and resilience. And we're going to resist that. Toyota is known for resisting the idea that there's automatic trade-offs between, for example, productivity and quality in manufacturing, between engineering hours and lead time in product development, et cetera. Toyota has always made it clear that they're going to put the emphasis on saving human lives and rescuing communities before their own production recovery. And having done that consistently over the years, it's won them a lot of goodwill from not only the public, but from their suppliers, even from their competitors. And what they try to do is they have a lot of ongoing frontline engagement with what's going on in their production system, and they try to connect that to all of the disaster risk assessment and mitigation that they're doing. So they've got this advanced team made up of staff who are in and out of these factories all the time and doing daily Kaizen and participating in annual Hoshin planning, et cetera. And then you've got experienced folks back at headquarters who are making up this sort of disaster response center. The fact that they put it within production control and not somehow separate in a sort of BCP unit on its own is extremely significant, because it means it's automatically integrated into ongoing operations at Toyota. And those experienced staff at the center are often the people who used to be working in the sites. So during a disaster, the advanced team, first of all, sets up a war room at the site for quick diagnosis that's communicated to this corporate disaster center, response center, which is going to deploy the main recovery team. a lot of what we've documented there is how Toyota, in a spirit of Kaizen and continuous improvement, has really learned a lot of lessons after each disaster and incorporated them into the sort of protective activity for the next set of disasters, whether it was typhoons, fires, earthquakes, and the like. So a couple of other things to say about Toyota. Toyota does not have zero inventory or anything close to it. And that's really been true. So just in time, and the idea of trying to push muda to zero, where inventory is considered muda or waste. Yes, but there's still a carrying level of inventory that Toyota has always argued is necessary. And it's been roughly 2 weeks. And that's even true in Japan, where the supply chains are short and where they have obviously the longest term relationships there. Toyota's inventories have risen since the 3/11/11 earthquake and tsunami, and doubled in value. And it's not that they're raising this inventories of everything. They identified, I have this on the next slide, like 1,500 key parts that they have to watch constantly and consider increasing their inventory level for. After disaster, they put tremendous effort into recovery first, and they have become very good and very fast at doing that and knowing how to bring resources outside of Toyota to that. They don't like to substitute very early because they want to maintain trust with suppliers. They're not going to use this as an excuse to go out and get new suppliers. Shinseki fire, there have been, it's quite a famous case. There have been articles about how quickly Toyota worked with a whole network of suppliers, including some that had nothing to do with the parts at Aishin, to be able to get that plant back up and running after a couple of weeks. And then the protective activities that I talked to already that they've done with COVID. And, it seems that these investments are paying off because Toyota seems to so far be steering clear of the chip shortage, which is shutting down a lot of their competitors. Some of what we know about this is that this rescue database with a real-time hazard map, this reinforced supply chain under emergency that's monitoring these 1,500 essential parts, was picking up really early signs of these chip shortages because they saw it in small orders for the suppliers that were supplying the chip makers, and just the incredible amount of communication that they have with these chip makers all the time. So they boosted early to a 4-month supply, which is part of why they're okay in this situation. I've already talked about the quick protective moves they made to make factories safe. They've had hardly any downtime in their factories, not just in Japan, but anywhere in the world. And another thing Toyota is very good at is flexible production and being able to mix models on a given line. And that meant they were able to shift volume around the world to different sites. The Corolla, for example, is a world car, so they could switch some Corolla production to a site where COVID was already under control. Toyota actually became #1 in the world in sales in 2020, surpassing Volkswagen. Now, lest you think I only have Japanese examples, Procter & Gamble is a US firm that's pretty famous for what they do here. And I'll just quickly show you that in all of these 3 capability areas, they've done a lot as well. A lot of similarities in Toyota in philosophy, values, and goals. And these examples are mostly from what they did in Hurricane Katrina and Rita, which came later the same year. In Katrina, they found they didn't shut down some of their factories fast enough before the hurricane hit. And in coming up with faster shutdown procedures, they were ready for that in Rita, which was only about a month later. They figured out that there was a risk of mold in the aftermath of the flooding that happened with Katrina, so they needed to put in many more generators for air conditioning. They already had generators for everything else for the factory, but not for air conditioning, but they found that was essential. This is a great case, I think. So one of their facilities that makes 20% of the coffee consumed in the US was only mildly damaged, so not a lot of problem getting production back. But the employees who worked there, their lives were just wrecked, hugely disrupted. So all the recovery went to helping the employees, right? So you've got trailers for people to live in, you've got meals, you've got work schedules to give people long shifts, but then time off to go back to their homes and their families, counseling for employees because there was so much trauma, truckloads of potable water. They got the facility reopened in 3 weeks, and tremendous goodwill from their employees and from the community. And they did substitution as well. So they had switched their packaging for these coffee products to all plastic, but they had a can supplier they'd used a few years back. They went to the can supplier, said, "Can you start up your line again for us?" They were able to make sure there were no empty shelves in the store. They just marketed to say, "Hey, same coffee, now it's in a can, don't worry." And they hardly lost any sales in 2005 at all. So Procter & Gamble definitely belongs on this capability map. as spanning the three and integrating across them. Let me just wrap up here by saying the following. You're going to hear it over and over and over again that we've got to have more resilience, so we've got to have less efficiency. Don't go for it. Take this focus instead on shifting the performance frontier by investing in capabilities. And this means, daily operations are where you hone the strength of those capabilities, and then proactive investments go along with it too. So BCP is good. It's just not sufficient. It often gets too fragmented from the rest of what the organization is doing. It's too backward looking. These three capabilities absolutely complement each other. And you can see from both Toyota and P&G, I think, why there are some great competitiveness advantages in investing in these capabilities rather than buying into this trade-off argument. So I'll stop there and look forward to the comments from Romain and Al and the discussion to come.
All right, great. So I'm gonna have Romain lead off, and then Al will follow. Thanks so much, Paul. Take it away, Romain.
So what we've seen from our chair is you can have the most resilient supply chain, the most efficient supply chain, but when you don't have equipment, when you don't have capacity, you have to really work with your vendors and integrators and come up with some creative solutions. And what I mean by that is, last year in 2020, a lot of our customers, clients, in the first 2 months of Q2, April and May, completely exacerbated their transportation spend because of the rates in the market. Now, keep in mind, when we went into COVID, all the wide bodies came out. 31% of the capacity came out of the market. The demand's still there. I mean, we might have been working differently, but the demand for parts for your computer, parts for this, parts for your car, cleanup stuff, all stuff people were doing while they were working remotely. So the demand was still there to consume. But what do you do when the capacity dries up? And then you have employees that have to move the goods. You have manufacturers. So what I saw work extremely well is the customers, the clients that had very, very good relationships with the manufacturers or their vendors were the ones that had, and John Paul, you alluded to that. Relationships when there is a crisis is critical. Maybe when there's not a crisis, you can go cherry pick from vendor to vendor, manufacturer to manufacturer. But when there's a crisis, you have to have that relationship. And that's what we saw. The ones that were deeply rooted with their OME were the ones who came out better. And then we also saw, could companies pivot? Could they pivot if they could not make it in the market? What I mean by that, what did we all need in Q2 and Q3? We needed PPE equipment. No one had it. We were first weeks in March, first weeks in April, even going into May, we're all looking for a mask. We're all looking for gloves. We're all looking for gowns. Not so much us working remotely, but the frontline grocery folks, the frontline medical field, the frontline our drivers, everyone frontline that had to be out in the general public. So we had companies that pivoted, that started manufacturing PPE equipment. Vodka companies, the great team of Dallas Cowboys, no jerseys were selling. So they started pivoting making PPE equipment. So there's going to be a lot of learnings that come out of this. How you pivot of a disaster. There's one thing of a disaster being isolated, but this disaster affected the entire globe. Different times in different countries handled it in different ways, as we all know. But there are going to be critical findings on the supply chain on how you pivot. My humble opinion is you're not going to, and this happened even before COVID, when the 301s and the 321 tariffs, and those are tariffs, and I don't want to talk too much in the weeds, but there were tariff changes that affected duty and taxes from goods coming out of China into the US. So there was a lot of companies that moved manufacturing, Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, and they did it for a benefit to them. I would advocate, I'd be a strong component of, what about Central America? What about Mexico? And you're going to start well, you know that, John Paul, automotive started moving that, 10, 12 years ago. And so they don't rely on one destination. So Toyota's a perfect example. After what happened to them, they set up a shop in Mexico. So I just think that, the better relationship you have when you're going through a disaster, you will go to the head of the food chain. And then the capacity, integrators have to give the customers different options. Unfortunately, the options aren't cheap. And I'll just talk about the 40-foot TEU that goes on a steamliner. We had equipment shortages anyway before the Suez Canal issue. With that boat being stopping the Suez Canal passage for 7-8 days, whoever you believe, it was 7, it was 8, that puts the steamliner back 10 to 12 weeks now. 10 to 12 weeks. I see it as a consumer. I was in Target over the weekend with a friend. They're like, why is this store empty? I go, it's real easy. Their supply chain's out of kilter. And you could have the most resilient, most effective, but if you can't get goods into you because the steamliners are on the water or the equipment is in Long Beach, you can't make a boat overnight. You can't make containers overnight. You just can't. So it's really the capacity, and the demand hasn't changed and the capacity. So I see still very strong headwinds going definitely in Q2 and going into Q3. I don't see it changing at all. We don't know when the wide bodies are going to go back in the market. When I say back in the market, across to Asia, I'll just give you an example. People think because we have these brown, beautiful aircrafts in my background, they think, well, you got all these planes, you can move all the freight. We have our network set up for our small package operations. So we move so it's just all about allocation of the aircraft. It's about asset utilization. So our small package is where your margins are. And those are the most critical packages. So you don't know what we're moving around the world from. Obviously, you saw the media, we're moving vaccines. So really critical stuff. So that is a priority. So we move about 19% of our air freight on our brown tails. The rest we have to go. And the airlines love us for that because they want an asset, utilize their aircraft. So I just see headwinds in the rates. And I'll just give you, for example, on rates. So pre-COVID, a 747 that holds about 100,000 tons. On a high side was about $350,000 round trip. It went as high as $1.8 million in Q2. And people were paying that. Right now it's about $900,000. So yes, it's a stable, but it's a high stable because the capacity is still not there with the wide bodies going back, carrying people that we utilize the bellies for freight. So I wish I had better news. So there, from China to Europe, there are some solutions where all the integrators are heavily using the rail, but that's starting to dry up. And the rail is gotten a lot better over the past 5 years, moving the rail from China into Europe. But I see we're still going to be in the thick of things 2021. And then I think the supply chain executives are going to probably be on the most senior staff under the CEO because of the cost. They're going to want to know more about supply chain and be more involved with the CFO on what do we need to do different, or maybe the manufacturing folks on can we do something different in different markets, because I'm not going to go through this again. And I truly think you're going to see the supply chain executives be just as critical as the CFO or the senior VP of commercial. So I wish I had better news. Al, I don't know what you're seeing because you're getting product.
All right. Well, Al, we'll turn it to you now in terms of what you see and how you understand the framework that Professor McDuffie is offering. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, thank you. So yeah, very interesting talk, and John Paul and Romaine. I was kind of laughing throughout because as a working for a PC manufacturer now, 2 different roles. One at I always say the 4-letter company based out of Austin, and then now with Lenovo based in North Carolina.
By the way, Al,
Yes.
my device is a Lenovo. I just thought
Okay.
I had to tell you that.
Yeah.
And they want to give me a bigger machine. I go, no. I love my Lenovo. Do not
Nice.
touch it.
Well, you guys are great customers, and I fly up to your New Jersey offices. I used to quite often meet with Mr. Scott Bender up there, and we would talk about PCs all the time. So I'm in regular contact with you guys. But you know what I see is, I'll give you another frame of kind of disaster, recovery into what is a disaster, right? How do you prevent it? So if you go back to COVID times, right when COVID first hit, our demand demand in the industry dropped initially, and then it U-turned, right? And so people weren't sure what to do, right? When first everybody went home and everybody said, well, is this gonna be a day? Is this gonna be a week? Is this gonna be a month? How long is this gonna be? And nobody knew what to do. And then COVID hits, right? And then all the schools, all the kids are home, right? Everybody needs PCs. Everybody needs anything with glass, right? Glass becomes a big problem because everybody needs something to work on from home. And then all the businesses said, well, we're going to work from home too. So PC demand spiked. So we went from, IDC says the market went down 9% in the first quarter of COVID. In this most recent quarter, it was up 55% year over year. So now our business, we grew about 20-something%, right? We were able to, we talk about relationships and lean on people and we need more supply, whatever. But when you're the biggest PC manufacturer in the world and the market's going up 50 and you're growing 30, that 20% gap is huge. And you have lots of really frustrated customers that don't understand why they can get PCs from you, right? So it's at one level, it's a nice problem to have, right? Relative to the other problem of no demand and lots of supply. You'd rather have more demand and less supply, but it's a sort of disaster, from a relationship perspective with your customers. And UPS has a lot of orders with us right now, and we're trying to get them, right? And so hey, put them on our planes, fly them over, and we're good. But we have this problem. This little tiny inexpensive piece is integrated circuit, and they're also in the glass. They're embedded in the glass, touch screens, all the technology now that's in your screens. And now we're battling with the auto industry for these ICs. Because when the auto industry doesn't have it, then their factories shut down also. You have lots of people unemployed. The auto industry is widely distributed around the world, and it's very politically well connected. and you start having presidents and premiers and other people calling the IC manufacturers for more than their fair share, right, of what's available. And what happened was the auto industry, for most part, they also saw a in the world scenario with COVID, and they stopped ordering, right? Everybody backed off their orders, and then everybody came rushing back into the market. And so the manufacturers, they started idling, slowing down, all their requests, their manufacturing. And then you had COVID hitting factories, right? All it takes is 1-2 people in a factory to get COVID, and the place has to shut down, right? Those were the protocols, right? If this happens, this factory needs to shut down because we don't want to spread the infection. So even though we had factories around the world and our competitors have factories around the world, anybody that doesn't protect you. And that's why I was intrigued by your, COVID over everything, because, one person gets sick, it causes mayhem, in the whole, no matter how much redundancy or resiliency you have built in. And then you have this crazy demand. So now we're in a situation where we're seeing the shipping rates going up. We're seeing every component price go up right now because of this incredible demand. And I'll tell customers, if I can't get the letter L on the keyboard, right? If some manufacturer can't supply that to me, I can't ship you a system without the letter L on it. So all it takes is one component in these really, kind of complex systems, and you can't ship. So there's lots of things going on in this environment. And I could, I'm on regular calls with my customers every day. I'm on a call with a customer trying to, hey, here's what we're doing. We're trying to solve it. Here's when it's going to get better. But I share Remaine's point of view that, this is going to be a rest of the year scenario, at least we hope. And eventually demand will start to come down a little bit because hopefully everybody goes back to school and people go back to the office, and we'll see a little diminishing of demand. But then all of our customers and even school districts, others are building resiliency, right? Well, we want to make sure instead of having desktops, everybody has a notebook, right? So no matter what, this thing comes back, we're ready to shift back. And so there's a lot more planning, I think, taking place even by our customers to think about how can they, and we've gone from centralized shipping to one location to like, hey, can you ship to our employees' homes, right? Can you do that for us? And because they don't want to be having to have people come to any central location in the time of COVID to pick up systems, right? Because that's danger for everybody involved. So lots of changes going on, not only by us, obviously, as we try to work with our supply base, but also with our customers and how they're rethinking about their business and how they want to react and make themselves more resilient in this new COVID world. So I'll pause there, Jerry.
Yeah, so what we're gonna do is I'm already getting a bunch of questions in, and I'm gonna bounce them back to our panelists, and thank you very much. So John Paul, I'm gonna ask you very briefly to give your response or sort of quick thoughts on both what Romaine and Al are saying, and how do you take that in as you're trying to rethink this problem of resiliency and efficiency? Oh wait, you got to turn on your thing. Yeah, microphone. There you go.
Yeah, I think the first thing to say is, and I could have emphasized it more, but it came across loud and clear from them. Nobody could have anticipated COVID or what COVID was going to do to supply chains. So in a way, to criticize, any firm, any government is a little bit, there are better and worse ways to respond, but who could have anticipated it? You could spend a lot of time on that and I think not get so far. Now, the people who follow the dangers of these kinds of, of diseases in the coronavirus family, we should have been listening to them, certainly as a world. And the other point I wanted to make that as to PPE, which Romaine was talking about, I mean, I think it may be entirely possible that for public health reasons, government should be stockpiling something like PPE, which is after all not super expensive in normal times and doesn't obsolesce. Now, there are some examples of government stockpiling, medications for some return of, either vaccines or pharmaceuticals, and they have a sell-by date, right? And so if that stockpile suddenly is gone by, then that's an investment that really wasn't worth making. But I think so certain kinds of national priorities, public health priorities may call for unusual amounts of stockpiling beyond what I was talking about. But my basic argument is that, for a company, competitiveness issues, which translates into efficiency and quality and all those kinds of metrics, are every day, all the time. Disasters are rare, they're occasional, and you can never get your planning for them exactly right. So if you switch away from competitiveness and a focus on efficiency, thinking that you're going to make yourself more resilient for all these unknown future things, you'll probably get it wrong, and you will have lost a lot of competitiveness in the process. And so all of the work that both of them and their organizations are doing to be constantly adapting to this unfolding set of events and developments is exactly a capability that both of their firms have and that they actually embody. And that's in a way what I'm talking about. And they both work in the operations side of their business, so they have the understanding to be able to do that. So, I mean, in a way, they're great examples of, I think, embodying the capabilities that I think are necessary to get through this and to thrive.
All right. Let me give a question that's come across our airwaves a bit that people are referring to a little bit, and it affects all three of you. in one way or another. Relationships. So that is, we're not just talking about capacity or bulk sometimes, but you've all mentioned this idea of relationships, why they're important in terms of resilience, as opposed to, which is different from saying just stock up, right? And so Remain, we'll go around. Remain, how do you think about relationships and resiliency?
Well, I think of relationships is with the resilience. During COVID, you had to have it. But let's say we get out of COVID, whatever month and year it is.
Going forward.
Whatever the norm will be. I think there will be much greater attention to the relationship with the manufacturer or the vendor. It's so critical to understand what Al said. Will they call you and say, hey, we've had 2 people infected, we got to shut down this line, but this is what we can do on this other side, or whatever they can do. Do you build a devising wall? And, and some people are probably going to come up with that, so they don't have to shut the whole place down. I'll just give you, for example, our Shanghai, or what PVG, there was a security person that checks people's ID that tested positive. We had to keep our employees in the gateway until they got tested for 72 hours. So they were sleeping on desk. We had to make arrangements of getting food and water in. We had over 200 employees. And we're like, my concern is now I go to employee shift, this Toyota, take care of your employees first. And I want to pound on that, especially during a situation like this. Employees are first. The end. And if the employees know that you have their back, their family's back, they will do anything for you. So I think the relationships will matter so much more, Jerry, more than they ever have. And I think you're going to go upstream that to, people always talk about just-in-time inventory and what the plan is, but to like JP or John Paul said that, hey, if you stockpile and then like 3 major countries decide that's going to be what they're going to do because there's going to be a second wave coming, that's going to upset the manufacturing, a normal manufacturing. So the relationships is everything to be resilient. And I can go around client by client and you can tell the ones who truly valued what their OMEs were doing versus the ones that would go cherry pick.
Al, you want to?
Yeah, I think I'd echo a lot of that. I think there's 2 types of relationships, or I guess there's 3 types of relationships to think about. One is your relationship, obviously, as we talked about with your employees, and make sure that you're looking after them first. Second, you have a relationship with your suppliers, and as Jean Paul was talking about, you can't anticipate everything, and everything's to be in the contract. So you can't rely on, what was written or what was planned, because it's game over, right? There's a whole new game being played. And it takes that relationship you've built over time with your supplier to say, look, okay, now how are we going to work together to adjust to this new circumstances? And having that long-term relationship with them, and if it is more than price, hopefully it's something more than that. You can leverage that to make sure that you stay at least near the top of the queue, if not the top of the queue. And then the third relationship is with your customers, right? And how do you communicate with them? And we have and sometimes it's very painful. We have a history with our customers of being very transparent. And we tell them, bad news as early and often as possible, right? We don't want to be hey, how come you didn't tell me? We hate that. We want to be the first one with bad news, if it is bad news, or just, hey, warning, hey, we're seeing this happen. And we constantly get, well, your competitors aren't saying that. I said, I know, but they will eventually. And so that's kind of what we rely on that. So we build trust. It's not always a great conversation, right? It's not always something you look forward to having a conversation with the customer about, but it's building that trust. So then when you're in a situation like this, unanticipated, they know based on previous years or previous quarters or what have you, you've taken care of them, you've helped them. They know they've been prioritized, and they know you're doing everything you can to help them. That doesn't stop them from, being upset here and there, or, pressing you, but you're building off of that goodwill that you've developed over time. And you are having to sometimes pick your favorite child out of this, right? And you're going to rely on those relationships. Who's been with you the longest? Who have you partnered with? who will work with you to solve the problem as opposed to throwing it back on your lap. Because it's going to take, in situations like this, we ask our customers all the time, okay, tell us your most important order, your most important country, your most important, and how really do you need 500 or can you do 250, right? Help me help you, right? And that way, then they tell us, okay, yeah, I can do 250 this week, give me 250 next week. I don't need them all, I can't absorb them all the first week. So you get those partnerships and relationships working where you discuss these things with each other in a very open way, and then they'll work with you to solve it in most cases.
Hey, Jerry, I want to comment on something Al said. He said a very critical word there, and the transparency. I can't overemphasize, and I'm with you, Al. I'll be on a call with customers tonight about when can we get our inventory on the steamliners, and I don't care what you say you want to pay per TEU. There's a integrity process with our whole customer base, and the transparency is very critical on that. And I can't emphasize enough, whether it's transparency with your customers, obviously the trust and transparency, I don't deal with personally because I don't bring product out of OMEs, but our folks deal with them on behalf of our customers, the transparency of the OMEs, the transparency with our employees. I can't emphasize that enough. The thing I was concerned most about going into COVID was our employees. I wasn't concerned. I mean, just the goods were going to move, they were going to move. Utmost, it was our employees was the most critical thing above any, and way above anything else.
John Paul, do you want to come in and think about this? You've written a lot about these supplier customer relationships, and how do you see that being integral to these capabilities too, and what they're saying?
I mean, completely agree with Romain and Al. That whole thing about pushing out to a new performance frontier, probably the investment that helps you do that most is the investment in relationships. Because remember that the relationships bring you knowledge that you may not otherwise have. And it also brings, if you do it right, it brings the trust from the transparency and from the willingness to share the gain, but also share the pain, which is going to get you through some really tough times. And all those things are critical. I mean, maybe it's a little more natural to think of the sort of within the firm kinds of knowledge. I think of if you've got industrial engineers or other engineering people in and out of your factories all the time, they know as well as your people in the factory do every machine, which ones are new, which ones are old, which ones are burning too much oil, which ones, and then if suddenly there's a flooding and those machines are going down, you actually know what kind of mechanics you need to send in to work on them, what suppliers you need to get in to fix the older machines versus the newer ones. Unless you have those relationships and those visits and that knowledge kind of accumulating, it's accumulating in an engineer's head, but it's in that relationship. That's part of how you can respond faster and more precisely in recovery than your competitors can. But with suppliers, I think one thing that can happen in the kind of purchasing relationship and the kind of negotiating and the trying to get some kind of advantage in low margin situations is suppliers sometimes don't actually want to give their big, powerful customer very much information because that may give a bargaining advantage. And if that's the kind of situation you're in, and then suddenly now you're asking, oh man, I need way more information than ever because I need to anticipate, what is coming down the pike from you and how much of it you're going to give me. If they're in the habit of hiding information from you because they don't trust what you're going to do with it, you're going to be, sorry out of luck if they've got other customers that they feel differently about. So, this whole thing it was a big eye opener for Toyota in the 2011 tsunami and earthquake, that they had third, fourth, fifth tier suppliers that they had no idea who they were, whether they existed, were they single source, were they double source, where were they located in the world? They just trusted that every tier above them would take care of that. And they learned that they can't necessarily count on it happening. And they're the only ones who know how critical that little fifth tier supplier who makes that letter L right for the keyboard is. So when they started to gather that knowledge, they had to have the suppliers trusting them with that information to build that database and have it be worth anything. And if that had broken down at any point, that database would have been worth nothing. So I completely agree with that emphasis on relationships.
Okay, so this is you brought up a great example to segue into our sets of next questions. First of all, as a comment, Steve Charles at Sunoco said that relationships, so Sunoco, they are one of our benefactors and a great company here in South Carolina in packaging and logistics. Relationships were critical over the past year until the storm in Texas. The storm highlighted the importance also of having formal contracts and agreements with suppliers to protect our company in the times of limited supply allocation and total force majeure. We also found it critical to make sure our commercial agreements with customers around supply continuity should be aligned with the critical material and service supplier agreements that are needed to fulfill our commitments. So people are thinking about this quite a bit in our audience, but I want to bring up your last example. Okay, we have a set of questions that I want to put them up and think about agility. So one you could say is, John Paul, all of you were talking really about a general argument about getting greater agility. And is it just about agility though through numbers? So runways just get more suppliers, buy more, stock up more. And I don't think that's what you guys are saying. That's not where you get agility. And that goes to our first, so there's three sets of questions. One about firm size, one about where do you buy? Is you rethinking the map, literally the geographic map? And which relationships matter more or less in globalization. But Roger Gossett exactly talked about this question. He was the first one. So John Paul, and his thought during your talk was, how deep do you go into your deep dive, right? So part of your capabilities, you talk about three: protective, recovery, and substitution. Could you go into maybe, and any of you thinking about this idea, is there an idea about that do you just hand it to your tier one suppliers and tell them to go do it? Or how much do you want to go into how deep will you go into your supply chain to start to think of rethink these capabilities? So John Paul, do you want to just start with, since you brought up that example?
I'll say a few quick things. So, I mean, Toyota was outsourcing more. I'll just stick with the auto industry example, but I think it applies as well. They were outsourcing more of the value add of the vehicle because they had these close relationships with the Kairetsu and these almost captive suppliers. And they definitely had that tiered tradition of, we deal with the first tier deals with the second tier, so on and so forth. And those are the responsibilities. And, for Toyota, we're going to teach them all Toyota production system, but it sort of rolls down the system. And I think what they've realized, and this may tell us something about how the world is getting more complicated and interdependent, is that it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to cope with how vulnerable they were after the 3/11/11 earthquake and tsunami. And so they just put on this big push, which took them years to build this new kind of real-time update database, but it also is involved all this relationship and all this communication. And I mean, I can't tell you if there's anyone in Toyota who's saying, we went overboard, we don't need to be spending so much time with that little fifth tier supplier. But it may be, the fact that they got a little more early warning on the chip shortages that were going to affect all the auto companies, and they were able to make some adaptive moves early. That plus their good relationships with those suppliers is going to pay off for them hugely now. So I think you may have to go deeper than you think when you're the system integrator at the top who needs to have a picture of everything going on.
So Al, that would affect your business quite directly. I mean, is there a talk in Lenovo about rethinking how deep they should be evaluating their supply chains?
Well, I think, I said as he was saying earlier, John Paul was saying earlier, every time's a learning experience. I'm sure there's other smarter people that are looking into that now. But again, it's kind of a weird thing, so if we ship 20-30% more, it seemed like we had some resiliency, but was it enough? It wasn't 50% more, right? And so that creates the challenge. And so should you ever plan for whatever? I guess you can plan, hey, we have a 50% surge in our business, or are we ready for that? I mean, it's a nice problem to have. That's a lot of capacity to build up. And you're putting a lot of pressure on your supply chain, to be that flexible with you. And one of the comments you made around, or one of the questions came up around, I guess, a couple of things around, one about contracts. And contracts help you. Yeah, you have extreme service level agreements and such in there that demand performance. I mean, those are things that can protect you to some degree. But there's not supply, there's not supply. So what do you do, right? So it can protect you somewhat, but that's a force majeure or other rationale that maybe you get out of that. And then I read some of the other questions about, can you, locate more in the United States, or what do you do there? So,
Right.
if you think about the car industry was forever concentrated in the Midwest. Well, why? Well, the expertise is there, the suppliers are there, and it takes a long time even to migrate as it did to the Southeast, started to migrate, or it migrates to other places. So, most everybody in my industry, we have factories around the world, and they're not usually at full scale because everybody basically manufactures. All of my competitors, everybody from Apple, Dell, HP, they all manufacture in Asia, primarily in China. Foxconn has these huge factories, a lot of efficiency in those things. And even if you do set up factories around the world, they don't have the concentration power because your suppliers aren't there. You're still shipping parts from around the world to get to that factory. So if something happens, so everything has to be co-located basically for that to work when you're working in a kind of assembly industry, or you're kind of missing, like, for example, we can imagine a worst case scenario, something happens between the US and China, trade embargo or worse. It doesn't matter if you have a factory in Mexico or in Columbia, South Carolina. If you're waiting on parts, any one part comes from China, you're kind of stuck. So it's complex, and some things can be more easily manufactured completely locally, but it does take a concerted effort from not only the hub, of the industry, but all the spokes and all the piece parts all have to be there or co-located to some degree for it to work. You can't have basically one deviation, or it doesn't work as well, because any one other thing can disrupt you. We all kind of, or most of us, I think, lived through 9/11. All of a sudden, all the planes are down on the ground, right? They're all parked, right? So if you're relying on any part to be flown in from anywhere in the world, no matter where you have that part, there were no planes flying, right? And so anywhere in the world, at least anywhere in the United States. And so, these are things like, these unanticipated occurrences, and you try to anticipate as best you can. But, for a real disaster like we've had with COVID, you have to have thought of every possible situation that could occur, and nobody could have imagined some of this. Nobody could imagine 9/11. I don't think anybody was on anybody's radar to imagine we'd have, every plane on the tarmac in the United States for a period of days, if not, I can't remember, weeks or so, till it all sorted out. These are just really weird, unanticipated black swan events, as they call them. But I like the thought. You got to plan. You got to be thinking about it, right? And then how do you do it? And then you learn from each occurrence, and hopefully you get better each time. So it's kind of a long answer to your question, Jerry. But I know we're thinking about it. We have meetings all the time now about supply. It's a constant, discussion. I'm more aware of it than I've ever had to be, because I got to explain this to our customers on a daily basis.
Right. Oh, well, this is, I think that came from David Zalesny about, and a few others, and a couple of my colleagues, Michael Murphy and Tatiana. You picked up on that, Tatiana Kostova, about this question about the expanding or the more contracting supplier systems. But a similar and related question about size, and I'll throw it first to Romain and then John Paul, is, well, there are several people, Diddy Caldwell, Trina Weeks, are asking, really, what does this mean for small, medium-sized firms? So if you have resources, a lot of the solutions, even the 3 capabilities that John Paul McDuffie mentions, well, you could see that if you were a large firm. But if you're not really a large firm, how do you think about agility? So, Romain, you talk to large and small firms.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of SMBs, and they, I was surprised. An SMB could pivot a lot quicker than a large enterprise. You talk about pivoting. Most of the customers I had mentioned, were small and medium businesses that pivoted during this pandemic, and they did quite well. I think they rely more on integrators to come to the table opposed to the enterprise customers, because they have their own whole infrastructure of procurement, sourcing, so forth, and you know, where is the best place to do this? How can we get this type of product from where? So I think I can give you some really good examples of how the SMBs pivoted very well. I think they did a much better job than some of our larger customers. I think they're more resilient because they have to be, quite frankly. The enterprise has, everyone overlooking them, you know, and that's why I like dealing with the SMBs, because they are so resilient and they are so open to change in different models. They're more open than any enterprise. It's like, hey, what do you think about this? What do you think about going to Honduras? What do you think, you know, and they will give it a try because they're not risk, you know, I'm not going to name any names, but if they did something very risky, it could really affect the bottom line. And I think the SMBs were in a great position to do different things in the market in 2020, and I think they'll prosper from it in 2021.
John Paul, what's your
Yeah.
thoughts on firm size issues?
Well, so I absolutely agree. You know, big organizations have resources and some advantages, but they also have a lot of inertia. They have a hard time making decisions about things. Even though we all know sunk costs are sunk, they tend to not want to move away from past investments, and they don't pivot as quickly. So I mean, from a speed and responsiveness point of view, a small size can be an advantage. The other thing I think of is a lot of smaller companies are, instead of having, you know, invented their own custom idiosyncratic systems, they're drawing on general resources of different kinds, general servers, general software, which they adapt modestly to their purposes. You know, I think of all the restaurants that kind of quickly had to pivot, and to have something like Shopify where they could quickly have a really easy to use website for selling some of their products, to, you know, with payment systems that are really efficient for people. You know, I guess the existence of the delivery services also were something they could use, although the economics there were challenging for a lot of them. But the point is, if you are already assembling the building blocks of your business from a lot of kind of more general purpose resources, and some of them go away, you're probably going to be able to find others to, like the whole substitution thing, I think is in some ways easier for a small business, but it's just as important to have thought a little bit ahead about being ready to do that and know some of the other options. I mean, maybe you went shopping for a software vendor not too long ago, and you know, if you have to switch from one to another, you can do that, or some other kind of supplier. So some of this, you know, mental preparedness, knowing that any given plan may not be right, but that sort of mental readiness is key to agility. I think a lot of SMEs have an advantage there.
Yeah, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to finish up on another common question out there from a few people, some of our alumni, some of our colleagues here in the building. And it's about understanding these supplier relationships and agility again, or because there seems to be a tension, and you could see it in these questions. Does agility and resilience mean, like, okay, when COVID goes down, people are you saying, you know, everybody's going to go back to just sort of like global supply chains, and just all they're going to do is just go find a few more options? Do you think that that's their solutions are going into it, or does region come into play? I think if you think about relationships, obviously they may be better and easier to manage in many ways when they're nearby, where they're a social group, a professional group that you understand a little bit better. Let me lead with Romain, since she had her hand right up on that one. Yes, but you oversee everything, and you got to go soon too.
Well, no, I got to go now. So real quick, the resilience is you're absolutely spot on with that comment. But you know, I just want to keep going back to capacity. It's all about capacity right now. none of us can change this on the call. You can have the most resilient, the best relationships, but if you don't have capacity, you still cannot move goods. And we're all faced up with that. That is why Al is on the phone with his customers. He can't get product. Can't get product.
Right.
Just can't get product. It's the capacity. And that's where you got to think, when do I don't want to rely on the steamers. I don't want to rely on the aircraft. You know, I saw a lot of comments, buy in US, manufacture in US, you know, and I don't want to get in that whole debate, but those are going to be some findings that's going to come out of this. So I truly love this energy on this panel, but I have to get onto a board meeting, which I'm going to be late now. So JP, great presentation. Al, great seeing you. I love my Lenovo. Thank you so much. And look forward to seeing you. Take care.
Okay, bye. Thanks.
Hey,
for
you
that.
guys still
Thank you.
stay on. We
Good job.
haven't officially ended, but I want to swing back to Al and then with finally John Paul on that point about more suppliers and relationships. And this is still a tension, and it has to do with how people are understanding where globalization is going.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add, the tension around lots of suppliers or a few suppliers, right? So for a while, it was just, as John Paul was talking about, nobody really knew what was going on, right? They kind of had their suppliers, maybe they proliferated over time. And there was a big consolidation effort over time. Hey, look, we're dealing with too many suppliers. Let's get this down to the critical few. And so there's always that tension between more suppliers and fewer suppliers. Fewer suppliers, you're building stronger relationships, but then you're more dependent on them to deliver, right? They could have a misstep. In recent year or so, we've had between Intel and AMD, they both had their good days and their bad days, or good quarters and bad quarters in supply. And so basically you have a duopoly, right? So if one goes down, AMD is way too small to make up for Intel, failing. They can make up some of it, but so even though you try to serve it or have two suppliers for processors, in reality that there's only one big one that has about 90% of the market. And if they misstep, there's a problem. They had a factory in Arizona that had a power outage and it destroyed, millions of chips in the factory. And suddenly the industry is, we're all short, and then AMD tries to pick up, and it goes back to what was just said about capacity. They didn't have capacity to quadruple. They're relying on third-party manufacturing and TSMC to go build their chips for them. So now they're getting ready to spend $100 billion over the next several years to add to their capacity. So it just takes, some of these industries take a massive investment over many years to really see a stepwise improvement. And these aren't gradual improvements. They have to be like, okay, it's either spend nothing or spend $10 billion or spend nothing or $20 billion. And so it takes a while for this capacity to expand. And that's why people look at this COVID situation. Is it just going to continue hyper demand for next 2 years or 3 years, or is it a several quarter blip? And I don't want to spend $10 billion or $20 billion to build capacity for something that's about to go away. Then it turns into from a seller's market to a buyer's market like that. And suddenly they have too much capacity. And then now things get really inexpensive, which is great for consumers, but bad for the business, right? That's manufacturing those chips, for example.
Well, you could have distributed capacity. So John Paul, we got to finish up. I'll give you the last word on your thoughts about this relationship, new capabilities in the supplier systems.
Yeah, big topics. I guess in terms of the thinking about globalization, right, that firms are in the middle of, and also governments. I mean, to me, it's part of the normal assessment of competitiveness to kind of be watching and rethinking some of that. And I think I've felt in recent years that we're probably having a less global world in terms of supply chains, but we may have a more regionalized world and not entirely a return to home country nationalism entirely, right? So again, auto industry, I know it better, but that means, you've got Mexico and Central and South America developed, and Canada also pulling some things back from China. Some of it may come into the US, but it certainly comes into the region. Western Europe builds up Eastern Europe. Southeast Asia takes over a lot of support for Asia, not all China. And, there's a lot of good reasons for that. It's not just geopolitical competition with China. The wage gaps between China and the rest of the world used to be 20-1. Now it's 5-1. With 5-1, then it doesn't make as much sense to take everything to China for low labor costs. So that to me is more part of an ongoing process of rebalancing and rethinking what's going on in the world and in your supply chains. And I think that trend away from really super diffused globalization towards more regionalization is I think the trend. But I think a bigger dilemma is what you do when you get these situations where, like this firm in Japan that had the fire, Renesas, they ended up being the only maker of a certain set of critical CPUs for automobiles back in 2011. 60% of the world got certain critical CPUs from that one factory, which is the one that got hit by the tsunami. Why did that happen? Well, there was consolidation in the industry, a bunch of mergers, and then there were some years of too much capacity, and everybody said, we can't invest now because we have no idea when it's going to come back. And these step function, as I was saying, it doesn't you can't do this on you got big step function investment. If you don't do it, you're way behind. And if you're going to make the huge investment to get a lot more capacity, that's going to take you a while. So now we're seeing it with chips. We're not going to fix it fast. But if I were betting on a future with Internet of Things and with cars becoming, computers on wheels and more, I think investing in chips is going to make a lot of sense. And I think for governments to help invest in chips is not at all a short-sighted move. That may be controversial, but I'm actually happy to see the US having that discussion instead of Intel just giving up on ever manufacturing chips again and allowing it all just to be a design shop and have all the manufacturing go elsewhere.
All right, thank you very much. By the way, another shout out to a couple of our MIB alumni, including Alec out there. All right, Karen, you can close it out.
Well, from the Folk Center, thank you to the panelists for your great insights today. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Have a good evening.